it over to Nick.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for that great introduction. Yeah, we were just talking before this how we wear multiple hats. So I um, used to work at the Autism Center at the Hospital for Special Care. I used to work at UConn School of Medicine in the Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities. Now I work at UConn Stores, which is closer to where I actually live. And my wife is a professor there. And so I'm an associate research professor in the Department of Educational Psychology. I work primarily on a grant project, CEASD. So we're looking at really academically talented individuals with autism and how we can help support their transition. So this summer, we're actually offering an online program in partnership with UConn's pre-college summer program. And so you may have seen some recruitment materials about that. I'm also a licensed psychologist where I work in my own business, educational testing and consulting. And as a part of that, I do a lot of work in the Learn area down in southeastern Connecticut. So they hire me. So I have multiple different hats in where work in multiple different capacities. Um, so I became really interested in this topic as I was working for EastCon at the time, and I was observing children with autism, adolescents with autism really move from the environment where they're being educated at EastCon into young adult life, and realized that there was a big gap here in what we knew and gap in the services that are provided. If you're not a child who has an intellectual disability, there aren't as many services and supports in young adulthood. And so I became really interested in this. And so this is basically what my research has been on since this time. What we know is that as children with autism develop into adulthood, they have really poor outcomes. So if you look across all the disability categories that receive special education services, students with autism are the least likely to attend any form of post-secondary education, to gain any type of competitive employment, or to live at all independently within 8 years of graduating. Um, I have a ton of citations here because not only have we seen that in some data on special education students, we've just seen that generally in clinical samples of young adults with autism. The special ed data doesn't always capture all students with autism, so there's sort of a caveat. So clearly there's a problem here that we need to fix and to solve. And so I'm going to try to talk about some of my ideas how to do that today. So depending on what your role is, I give the same information to everybody. So when I present to parent groups, I do a version of this presentation. When I talk to educators, I do the exact same version. So this is sort of this is what I think should happen based on my reading of the literature and also everything that Pat Anderson taught me. And I believe Pat Anderson is in the audience. So she used to work for the State Department of Ed as the transition person. So before I jump in and talk specifically about transition, I want to talk a little bit about the development of individuals with autism or autistic individuals. I have to change how I discuss this group now because different groups have come out and said we're going to use identity first language. So I'm learning and I'm making that change. What we generally know is that individuals with autism, it seems like their symptoms get better over the course of development, that the restricted interests, the repetitive behaviors, there seems to be sort of a plateauing, like they get better and they plateau. They still meet the criteria for autism, but it seems to get a little bit better over the course of time, which would be great, except for that other children have continued to develop. So these children have sort of come and they've plateaued often, but there's still a large gap between the skills that individuals with autism have and what their peers have. Not all individuals with autism have that steady development though. Just generally, that tends to be what happens. Things like comorbidity, so the presence of anxiety and depression, as well as any other psychiatric concern, can impact the level of functioning that an adolescent with autism has. If they've experienced trauma, that can impact. and the restricted interest, repetitive behaviors, that for some that continues, as well as the presence of challenging behavior. The other thing is I've just seen individuals with autism who enter puberty, and that entering that phase for whatever reason sort of is this risk to their development, and they have much greater impact from that. This is a long way of saying sometimes it's not the autism that's causing difficulties in adolescence, but all of these other things that come along with autism. Another important thing to consider is an adolescent with autism is always still an adolescent. So they're going through identity formation. They're trying to figure out who they are. We don't expect all adolescents to know their exact career paths that they're going to do for the next 40 years. We expect them to move into young adulthood with some ideas on that. And that's the same thing for people with autism. We're not asking them to pick 40-year careers and all of their independent living skills. People with autism will continue to develop and grow even after they exit the school system, whenever that happens. When I think about helping students with autism transition out of secondary programs into post-secondary programs, I think the thing that we have to start with is all students, regardless of whether they have autism, need to have high quality transition services. And that means we have to start early, like our Connecticut state law says we have to start at the IEP that goes in place as soon as they're 14. We have to adopt person-centered practices where we're working with the individual and their family to think about visioning for what their future should be. We have to focus on strengths of students and use those strengths to help them make decisions. And we have to help them to drive the ship by fostering their self-determination skills. And we need high expectations. We need to focus on inclusive opportunities. We need to really pursue improving the outcomes I talked about at the beginning. We need to have data-driven approaches, and we need to use strong partnerships, which is something I'm going to talk a lot more about. And we need to move beyond a compliance mindset. Those were the top 10 sort of commitments that a friend of mine, Eric Carter, who works at Vanderbilt, sort of said, this is what high quality transition is for all students. And I'm going to talk about how we can think about that in doing high quality transition for students with autism. The thing that we have to do is really focus more on academics. And this suggestion really applies to those students with autism that have some academic abilities, that they're in regular education primarily. They're not, we'll talk a little bit more in a second, but they may be getting some modifications, but largely accommodations. For those students, we can sometimes fall into this trap of viewing them like students with learning disabilities, that by the time they get to high school, they're kind of in this autopilot mode. They're compensating. We're maybe not providing a huge amount of academic instruction to them. We're just helping them sort of get through high school. I think it's really important to not fall into that trap with students with autism, because as IDA points out, and as this is from a Connecticut policy, which you'll see in a second, the purpose of education is to enable the child to develop skills towards independence and meaningful community involvement as an adult. It's not just focusing on the academics, it's really focusing on the whole child and thinking about their social skills, about their adaptive skills, and also thinking about the environments that they're going to enter in adulthood. As I'm going to talk about in a second, one of the challenges with a lot of the measures that are used with this population is they're really geared towards individuals who don't have this level of academic skills and who don't maybe have the potential to enter adult life in similar environments. In other words, they don't measure the advanced social skills, the advanced adaptive living skills you need to survive on a college campus or in a work environment. So we really need to think about that broadly. That's why the State Department of Ed talks about we need to really focus on these bigger outcomes, not just academic skills. We have to do transition services starting at age 14, which is really great. I think it's great that this law was passed and we now have to start early. So we're using a child's entire educational career to do that. And I think we need to think creatively about doing these services until they turn 21 or 22. I don't think all students with autism need to receive services until they're 21 or 22, but I think there's some opportunities to provide some transition only services to many students who maybe traditionally haven't received them, to help build that runway so they can take off in life, you know, so that they can fly their plane and take off in life. When we think about doing transition goals and objectives for these students, we need to use age appropriate transition assessments. And this is where I think we need to, it's that age appropriate, but also thinking about what are the skills in adulthood that this child, what are the environments they could be accessing? This is why in the day-long training I do on this topic with CERC, we spend a lot of time talking about ecological assessments, where you take an individual and you put them into a context, whether that's a college classroom, a college campus, meeting with the college disability service offices, taking that student on the bus, taking them to community activities that they may or may not have been involved in before, such as restaurants, shopping, taking them into those settings and using that information to say, what are the gaps in skills that this individual have, and how are we going to build their IEP so it focuses on helping them to develop those skills. Again, things like the Vineland, like the SSIS, the SRS, they're great, but for some students, they really fit that, they sort of are matching environments that they're going to enter. For students who have more academic abilities, we sometimes have to use more of an ecological approach to gather this information. I think for all students with autism, they should have something that focuses on some form of activities of daily living. It may not be directly on independent living skills in the traditional sense that we've thought about them in transition, but thinking about what types of advanced social skills, advanced other skills that they need in other contexts to be able to access the community. One of the things I see, because I see lots of young adults with autism, that 18 to 22 group, who come into my office and they're with their parents and they're like, I just failed out of community college, or I had a job and I was fired. And they're like, but in high school, I got all A's and everything was, you know, there were no problems. Everything was great. And when you sort of peek under the hood, you go, well, did you get, you know, were your grades modified? And they say, oh yeah, they were modified, but we're not really sure how they were modified, but yeah, they were modified. And so part of this is, and I think this is an important thing when schools work with families, is when we build objectives, I think we should have at least some of the objectives focus on independent completion. In an annual goal or objective, right? So the annual goal, there's several objectives. Some of those objectives could be about teaching, and they could have prompts and teaching involved. But I think we need something that says, can the child actually independently do whatever the skill is that we're teaching them? I think we can use fading prompts, we can do all those things, but I think we need to communicate to families, and families need to know, what can my child independently do, and in what context can that happen? I also suggest we use baselines as a starting point, so that it's not some sort of arbitrary, they're going to do 80% of it correctly, but let's say they're doing 50% of a skill correctly now. What can we improve that to? Can we improve that to 75% or 95%? And what would be a target that would actually be a meaningful target for them actually to use this skill in adulthood? So I think that's really important as well. In order to figure out what skills to teach, I suggest using things like the assessment of functional living skills for students who are still have really, really limited communication and may have no verbal communication. Using something like the VB map is there. I also like the Brigance transition inventory. When I do, and I'm asked to do transition assessments, I like to use that in addition to using something like the AFL. So these are great criterion reference measures that help you to see that. Again, what I would say is, for students that have more academic abilities on the autism spectrum, we may need to, these may show that they're fine, but we may need to look and see, but can they access the environments that we want them to access? There's also great adaptive living curriculum, the adaptive living skills curriculum, the functional assessment and curriculum for teaching everyday routines, the factor. Other curriculum that I think are underutilized are anything about healthy relationships and those things. I also see too many people who come into my office with some issues around some misperceptions on how to go about engaging in romantic relationships and friendships. So that's another area that can be addressed, and there are some great resources on that. When you do these transition assessments, you put it all together, you say what the child can currently do, you think about what their goals are for them, and that decides what services are in place, what annual goals and objectives are created, and it all sort of flows in together. I like to think of the whole transition assessment process as varying from student to student in terms of sort of the rigor of that assessment, right? And so that we have low stakes children in special education. These are students with learning disabilities, mild ADHD. We're pretty much like, they're going through high school. Generally, things are going well. We're giving them accommodations largely, not a lot of instruction. We can do some interviews and questionnaires with them, and that would be totally appropriate. We figure out what their interests are. We figure out how to help them get to the next step in terms of pursuing college or other post-secondary training and employment opportunities, right? It's pretty low stakes. The other end of the spectrum, we have really high stakes individuals, and these are individuals who have really significant cognitive challenges or emotional challenges, where it's a more high stakes approach. Like if we don't do this transition right, this child's can have a really awful transition into young adulthood and not have things. And that's where I think using things like life course planning or person-centered planning, I think is really essential. Now, obviously some individuals with autism kind of fit in this high stakes because they have concurrent intellectual disabilities. So I think they kind of fit in this group. I think the rest of the students with autism fit into this medium stakes category. I think we can do some interviews and questionnaires, particularly when they're 14 and 15 with them. I think we are also going to have to do some more intensive procedures and do that ecological assessment with them, looking at the relevant environments that they're going in. We're going to have to work with school psychologists and special educators collaborating and doing more broad assessments with them. That inform kind of what we think are potential environments that they could access. In other words, I think we can't just do interviews and questionnaires with a student with autism. We really need to look broadly at the whole child, especially like when outside of the academic sphere, if we need to provide any support around that. Just taking a look at time here for a second. There's so many different other skills, and Iris has some great resources on thinking about the different things that we need to think about in terms of education, employment, and independent living. These are different things. We also have our Connecticut core transition skills. I think that's a great document to look at in terms of setting goals and looking ahead to set goals. As I've already alluded to, I think there needs to be this balance about, especially for students with autism, looking at the standardized measures of IQ, attention and executive function, academic skills, social skills, adaptive living skills, and then using criterion measures like the AFOLs, like the Brigance, like other things that are out there, as well as some sort of ecological assessments together. And I think that's, the really important point. And I've harped on this a lot because I think it is so critical to think about this. And in the slide here, there's a link to a great document that talks about environmental and situational assessment and how that can be used in secondary transition. And I know what a lot of you are thinking, that's great, but how do we do all of this? And because we have these students who need to earn enough credits to graduate, and they need those credits so they can go to competitive colleges or community colleges. My second suggestion is I think we need to think about transition only services not outside of an 18 to 21 or 18 to 22 framework, depending on how that all gets settled. But for some students, I think we need to think about is fifth year programming appropriate? Can we build a bridge to whatever that next step is for that student? Can that student take a couple classes at community college while we're providing them with some transition only instruction in social and other skills to help them as they move into adulthood? And so I think that's really important, and that's using that transition only. To be honest, the law says it's about transition only services, but doesn't have like a demarcation of who should get those transition only services or not. It just sort of says students who were found to have transition only services. And I think that there's students with autism that fit in that category that haven't traditionally been fit there. And there's some great programs being run by individual districts in the state, and some other just general programs that exist that are kind of these bridge programs that exist. And this is kind of speaks to this third suggestion, which is we can't do this only in 4 years of high school, right? So maybe we need a fifth year. But if we're going to make that choice, we really have to partner effectively with parents, because the honest truth, and I'm sure there are parents and educators in this, schools can't teach all of the skills that students need to be successful in young adulthood. Some of this is going to have to be done in the community, and the parents are going to have to do this. And so sometimes when I work with schools and families, what I work with them to say is, what are the skills that the school needs to teach? And what are some skills that maybe we can work on at home? Like sometimes parents, she's like, we'll teach cooking and we'll teach laundry and those skills. You handle the skills that are really going to facilitate employment, for example. Because we need that partnership, and I think we need that honest partnership, and I think sometimes that sort of honest partnership the contentiousness sometimes of special education can get in the way of that, but I think it's really important to partner with families to make those decisions. As I said, I think life course I think is really, really important. The students that keep me up at night are those students that aren't college bound, but they don't have intellectual disabilities, because there's this gap of services that they can't access, or that there's this gap of services that aren't there. Like there aren't services for them to access. And I think it's important to talk with families about that really openly and honestly, that there are great agencies that provide great supports and services, but it may not be the level of intensity, particularly our friends on the autism spectrum who are in that area where they're not clearly college bound and they don't have intellectual disabilities. They need extra support and services, and using a life course framework to think about how do we build their whole program to get them competitively employed, because that's basically the only option that they have. There aren't a lot of other options in terms of employment or independent living for them. I want to end, and before I open it up for questions, by offering my suggestions for parents. So I think you really need to help individuals with autism understand their disability or identity, or whatever, however you want to frame it to them. They need to understand their strengths and weaknesses. I've sat in too many meetings with parents who, after they came in the big sign that said Autism Center, asked me not to tell their child that they have autism. And I think they had well-meaning intentions, where they didn't want their child to feel that label was their whole identity. But to be honest, I've sat in too many meetings with young adults with autism. When I ask them if they had special ed services or if they had a 504 plan, they can't answer me. But when I tell them, did you have this really nice person in your study hall that helped you with your homework? They're like, oh yeah, like I did have that person. And they don't realize that I know, because I've seen their records, that was their special ed teacher that was helping them with their homework. And that not all children have that. One of the things that's endemic to the autism spectrum is that lack of insight. My other suggestion for parents is to keep records of all of this. Sometimes multiple agencies are involved. You're going to have the Bureau of Rehabilitation Services. I think that's still their name. They keep, everything has changed around them. So I'm not, I think that's still their name. They're going to do an assessment, and you may have DDS involvement, and you may have DMIS, and you need to keep all of that. I think it's really important to review those IEP goals and objectives to make sure they're focused on transition, and so that when you get those progress reports, is there actual data that supports those things? It's also important to review graduation requirements and to make those decisions. If we do any type of curriculum modifications, if we limit the amount of homework, if we do that, that can really impact whether a child can easily access post-secondary education in terms of the expectations of those environments. So that's really important to think about. There's a lot of unique individual factors that determine whether modifications are appropriate or not, but I'm not saying modifications preclude attendance in college or other post-secondary ed environments, but it's important to understand that it could have that impact when you think about that. I think it's really important for parents to advocate for curriculum that will prepare their child for the goals and vision that they have. And outside of school, I think it's really important to expose all students on the autism spectrum to a wide variety of community and other environments, because that's the one thing I've also seen is too many of these individuals who've been sheltered from those experiences. And we need to try to at least expose them so that they can understand what they like and dislike. And I think that's that independence in home and community settings that I think is absolutely essential. So summer camps, college campus visits, driving, which is a whole huge issue in terms of trying to figure out whether driving is an option for a child, and then at helping them to develop as many independent living skills as possible within the home environment. This driving issue is for students on the autism spectrum is hard. The driving opens up so many adult opportunities, but there are many factors. It's sometimes we've thought about this only from do you have the reaction speed in order to drive? And some students with autism will have that reaction time there, but it's the level of anxiety that the driving can provoke, or the decision making that's involved, or the sort of, what if they got into a car accident, what would happen? And would they know how to navigate that situation, or could they be taken advantage of in that situation? So it's really complicated. And that it's also important to think about it, as I said earlier, not everyone is going to be ready at the same rate. And in terms of individuals with autism, maybe they're going to be ready later in young adulthood to explore that or other options. They do need to have some sort of transportation option. And so we need to think about that. I'm going to skip this because we've kind of already talked about it. The other thing is the greatest predictor of adult employment is whether or not you've had a job in high school. This data came out pre the Great Recession though. So I always say, get a job or volunteer. Some type of experience where the individual is not working with a family member, they're working with people. A, it gives them great experience, and B, we get to see what the challenges are when they're young enough that we can easily intervene and bring this information to the school to help them to do that. My last suggestion is these students need to be able to self-advocate for themselves. That's what the adult world requires. If I want to receive disability accommodations, I have to go to my boss to get them. If I'm a college student and I want to receive extended time on tests and I have a history of doing that, I have to go to my disability services office. I then have to go to my professors and ask for those accommodations. So I think all students, but particularly students with autism, should develop self-advocacy skills. There's so many different ways to do that. There are great, CPAC has a great curriculum on self-advocacy that I think is wonderful and helps to develop those skills. I think all 12th grade students with IEPs should be asking their regular education teachers for their accommodations so they get the practice of doing that, because they're going to have to walk up to professors during the first class of the semester in college to do the same thing. That's what I have. I took my hour-long presentation and did it in 34 minutes. So what comments or questions do you all have? That's my broad overview. The 1-day training I do with CERC every year really like goes in depth into all of that. That's sort of this is like the 20,000 foot view.
I
What I've
want to
seen.
thank you because I think you presented a lot of really valuable information in a condensed version. And so I thank you for doing that. I know it's hard oftentimes to condense things when it's so rich and complex. But I do want to just offer a couple of questions that came through in the chat. One was a question about the resources to which you referred with regard to relationships and dating. Are there curricula or other resources that you could potentially share with folks?
Yeah, I mean, so Oak Hill has some great curricula involved that they do.
And we
Yeah, so that's they have some great, and there's some other. I believe the UConn USAID website has some of other information on this. Tara Lutz, who works there, that's what she wrote her dissertation on. So she also has she knows every curricula that exists and is out there.
Excellent. Maybe what we can do, Nick, is we can, there were some other requests for the link to DDS and I believe someone might have had another question about a different link I didn't catch, but so perhaps we can just sort of compile some of these resources after the fact and post them.
Absolutely.
Are you also, I'm not sure if you're sharing the PowerPoint or just in the form of this video, but we can also potentially.
Yeah, I can also share this I'm happy to share this PowerPoint.
Perfect.
So.
And then I think one other question was about the continuation of services as it relates to reading, math, and writing instruction during transition.
Right, that all can continue, and depending on the student's needs, that can and does continue. I think it's important to realize that at some point, in the next phase of life, it's not going to be present. In terms of, so you could keep getting reading and writing and math instruction, and especially for functional purposes, all the way through your 21 or 22, if it's helping you to access those environments. In that 18 to 21 space, it's more functional. I kind of said sometimes that instruction doesn't happen as often in high school. It does, depending on the student's needs. And I went this whole time without using the word, but I will use it once. For higher functioning students, it's not worth giving them that extra instruction in reading because there are other skills we want to work on. And so, or because their reading is good, we're going to give them some reading comprehension instruction, but we're not going to spend a ton of time.
Yeah, and so I think if anyone else has any additional questions, please post them in the chat. I'll try to, or if I missed your question, please repost it. We did just have a question about who is the individual and where does she work who happens to be very knowledgeable about curriculum. I will get that from you, Nick, and we'll put it in a series of.
Right, we'll put that there. And I just put it in the chat. So I think I actually,
and the other question was about the link for DDS and Family Connecticut. So again, we'll compile all of these into a resource page associated with this presentation, and we will either send it out or post it to our website.
Right. And yeah.
Another question, how do
I was going to say,
are you looking? Okay.
About how do we support the end of the spectrum that also has intellectual disabilities. I downplayed that slightly here because that is much more complicated and that it's a much more involved process throughout the whole piece of it. And that they're likely to kind of automatically qualify for those 18 to 21 services, that we sort of know that they're going to continue to receive services. It's a lot of the same things I talked about using those criterion reference measures and building their skills, depending on their level of need, and working with DDS to determine their level of need. That will sort of also help to frame what adult life will look like. for that child in terms of the amount of DDS support that they'll receive. In terms of some of these students will receive residential services and will have day programming. Others of these individuals will have residential services and will be able to be in sort of supported employment or competitive employment. Others will not get any residential services and will be in competitive employment or other sorts of programming or services. And so that's a whole other can of worms to open, which I talk more about when I do this in a full day. And the certificate versus diploma, sometimes students can still receive a diploma and it's just held by the district, but the diploma also indicates that they have, and this gets really complicated, so this is like a way too short answer for this, but it's they have to met all the qualifications for the diploma in terms of credits and other things. I'm actually surprised this is still an issue because I'm pretty sure that that most people were still giving out, kind of the certificate thing had kind of went away. I thought everyone was getting a diploma. It just sort of, that sometimes there were stamps on the diploma and things, but it's a complicated thing. They should, all students should be able to walk at graduation. Joanna, every year I do it 2 days for CERC. So one in the fall, which will be virtual this year, and then we may do an in-person one in the spring, hopefully. So
I'm just going to say you are spectacular at monitoring the chat and responding to questions.
I've gotten to be too good at it because I've had to do it so much in all the online presentations we've done. I feel like I have like a degree in Zoom now.
Another added to your list, right? This was really great. I appreciate this so much. I don't see any additional questions. Nope, one just came in. Yeah.
Lee, I would say that usually when the certificate of completion is given, those students are going to receive assistance in terms of pursuing employment and lots of support. So I don't think it necessarily matters. And the question about college readiness instruments. Landmark College has one, but it's mostly for LD and ADHD, and it's not standardized. It's just like an interview of questions. It doesn't handle the social skills you need to go to college, I found, and I teach at Landmark, and so like I would agree with that. And there I don't know if there's a break or not, Carrie. That's up to you.
So the next session actually starts at 11:25. So there you have exactly 6 minutes. I did post the link to the dashboard further up in the chat. I will do it again just so it's for the effect of recency here and you can find it more readily. And then I will be moderating the session on recreation. So if any of you are coming to that, you will see my face shortly. I want to thank you again, Nick, for all of this information and for going through this as thoroughly as one possibly can in such a short period of time and monitoring the chat and doing a great job at both. So thanks for being here, everyone. Thank you, Nick, and we will send out additional resources associated with this once we've compiled them. You will also be able to find the recording of this session via our website as of next week. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.